There's a story in the Gospel of Mark. It's a pretty short story. It's about a father who brings his son to Jesus for healing. And we read in these few verses that the son had been plagued with seizures for we don't know how long. But for those of us who have children or you've cared for a child at any point in your life, you know the feeling that when your child suffers, you also suffer. So we can imagine that this father was experiencing great turmoil in his own life as well. And so the story goes that he went and he found Jesus and he called out to him in chapter 9, verse 22. And he says, "Jesus, if you can do anything, help us. Show us compassion." And then in verse 23, Jesus replies to the father of the son, and I'm going to add some emphasis on the first word of this next verse. I imagine maybe this is what Jesus would have sounded like. But in verse 23, Jesus replies and says, "If you can do anything," then he says, "all things are possible for the one who has faith." And I imagine this man must have just froze right there in his footsteps that Jesus would have said this to him. But in verse 24, the boy's father exclaims, he says, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." Really honest words from the father. And I think words that we can all connect with at one point or another in our life. Because here's something important to know. In each of our lives, we all struggle with doubt. We all doubt one thing or another at different seasons in our lives, and I want to affirm you that doubt is normal. But there's a measure of faith, a measure of trust that is required for almost every aspect or stage or season in this life. And so from the very beginning of this new sermon series that for the next 6 weeks we're going to be in called Wrestling with Doubt and Finding Faith, I want to say this phrase, and you're going to hear me say it every single week, that doubt is not the opposite of faith. I just want to affirm that and allow you to breathe easy at the beginning of the new year. Doubt is not the opposite of faith, but often it leads to a deeper faith. Doubt is not the opposite of faith, but often it leads to a deeper faith. And so this series is inspired by one of the larger United Methodist congregations in the United States, and they kept hearing that their church was struggling with doubt. So they did a survey of 1,000 people in their community, and they asked them, what are the things that cause you the most amount of doubt when it comes to your relationship with God, when it comes to following Jesus, or just really any aspect of this idea that we call faith, following Jesus, Christianity. And so they have put together some resources, and for the next 6 weeks at our church, we're going to study the list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, of the things that people in our culture and our day and age, this study was just done 2 years ago, of the top 6 things that people struggle with their faith, especially surrounding doubt. And so what we're going to do is we're going to name those things because it might not apply to you every single one, every single week, but as a whole, it will represent our whole church and everybody joining us online as well. And we're going to study the scriptures. We're going to study God's word. We're going to study and hear from testimony of folks who have raised their hand and said, yeah, I struggle with this. Yes, I have doubt about this, but here's how I have overcome that doubt. Or here's how I've moved forward in my faith, even if I might still have a little reservation. And my hope is that we will all be like the father in that short story from the Gospel of Mark, that we'll be honest with God and we'll say, God, I do believe, but will you help me overcome my unbelief? Because not all of us has it right all the time. We all struggle. We all have doubts, and that's okay. But the plan is to be strengthened in your faith over the next 6 weeks as we start the new year. But so for our first question today, we're going to start right at the top of the list. Before we get into some of the details of the story of our faith and the things we believe, we're going to ask the kind of the biggest question of them all. Is there really a God? Is there really a God? Now, there are lots of different ways that people respond to questions like this. For example, it couldn't have been better timing. Last week after church, one of the youth of our church came up to me and he said, "Hey, Pastor Robert, what are you going to be talking about in the new year?" I said, "Hey, so glad you asked. Nobody really ever asked that question, but thank you for asking. We're starting a new sermon series. It's called Wrestling with Doubt and Finding Faith, and I've never preached this sermon series before. It's going to be a lot of research, but I think it'll be really helpful." And he said, "Okay, well, neat. So what are you talking about next Sunday, right? It's the first Sunday of the year. You really want to make sure it's a good one, right?" I said, "Well, yeah, but every Sunday I try to make it a good one. But next Sunday, yeah, sure. First Sunday of the year, let's do it." And I said, "Well, we're going to be asking the question, is God real?" And I kind of paused and he kind of squinted at me and turned his head and he goes, "Well, is God real?" I kind of leaned in and looked at him. I said, "Of course God's real." And he kind of started back and he goes, "Okay, good enough for me. I'll see you next Sunday." Right? For some of us, for some people, hearing someone they know, someone they trust, someone they admire talk about something they believe is all that they need to believe as well, to make the jump of faith, to hear testimony, to hear a reliable source of information say, "This is what I believe." They'll believe it too. And that's just the way that it goes. But for others, and maybe for you, you need facts. You need proof. You need data. You need analytics. You need to have a Google report that shows you the outlines for all of the claims about anything before you'll believe it. And I'm not picking on you because that's just how you are wired, and that is okay. But I think it's safe to say that amongst our congregation, amongst the few hundred people that will be here this morning and those that join online, we've got a good mix of both. And a few in between, and maybe a few on the outliers as well. I imagine in the room we've got folks who have had a strong faith for the majority of their life. And doubt is really not something that maybe you wrestle with. And you're thinking, this is going to be a good series. I'm going to make it fine through the next 6 weeks. But we've also got folks who are brand new to the faith or have come back to the faith after a really long time, and they're just trying to keep up with all the lines and the rhythms and the rituals and why we do all the things that we do. But I also know for a fact that we've got folks who have been coming to church for almost their whole life or the majority of their life, and they're some of the biggest doubters of all of these things. All of these things. Really? The Bible? Really? Communion? You still believe in all that, but they're here every single week, and they're welcome because they're still exploring and trying to figure it out. But I also know we've got folks who don't feel like they're worthy to learn these things, or they're not smart enough to learn these things, and that's just absolutely not true. And I say it fairly often, and I should really say it more often than I do. Wherever you find yourself, and if it's any of the phrases I just described or somewhere in between, I want to remind you that you are absolutely welcome here. And I truly believe you are exactly where you are meant to be. Church is a community of people that come together, that wrestle and struggle with doubt and so many other things. And I believe that if your heart is in the right place, that you have an openness to God working in your life, that God will. And God does every single time. So back to the real question for the morning. Is God real? Maybe you've never asked that question. You've just grown up. You're like, of course God's real. Like I told our youth last week. This is not a question that I personally wrestle with or struggle with. And I just want to say that. And maybe it is one that you do. But I found that when somebody wants to come and have an appointment with me or go have a meal and they say, I'm really struggling with this, the biggest barrier between their belief in God, and I can't talk about all of them this morning, but the biggest barrier I have found is kind of the difficulty and the connection and the complexity between what the Bible has to say about creation and what science has to say about creation. So I don't want to waste any time. I don't want to beat around the bush. I just want to start right there, right at the beginning of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. And in the past, we've studied these stories in great detail here at church. So I'm going to give just a brief overview of those two chapters and their differences this morning. And then we're going to think about what science has to say about creation. And my hope is that you will be persuaded that there doesn't have to be conflict between science and faith, but rather that science can undergird what we believe the Bible and God has to say. And in the process, you'll see that absolutely God has to be real. And I just invite you at any time during the series, if you have a question about anything I say, just write it down, email it to me, let's get together and let's talk more about it. 22 minutes a Sunday to talk about a topic that would take 6 weeks is really, I'm going to talk fast, all right? And we're going to go on. So here we go. So there are two creation accounts in Genesis, chapter 1 and chapter 2. And the first thing I want to say is the people that wrote those two books of the Bible, their scientific understanding of the world around them would have been a lot different than ours today. Okay? Very different context, very different time in history. I think that's helpful to remember. So, most scholars agree that the aim of the first creation story, which is Genesis chapter 1, was to clearly assert that behind all that exists, there is God. Behind all that exists, there is God. So God's creation is good. It is beautiful. It is a gift to humanity. Humans were created by God, and humans bear God's imprint or God's image. You've heard me say that before. You were created in the image of God. You are a person of worth. That's what Genesis 1 tells us. Genesis 2, on the other hand, it's the second account, is written in prose. It's a masterful short story that helps us think about some of the big things like the meaning of life, our struggle with loneliness, the power of relationships, and our human struggle with temptation and sin. This is the story about the fruit and the serpent, right? The first one is about the 6 days of creation. Oftentimes, we blend the two stories together into one in our minds because it's easier to think about, and it's easier to understand, but they're actually two different stories. But these stories, both of them, they offer us theological and existential truth. But hear me say this, they are not written as science lessons. They are not written as science lessons. The stories are not attempting to explain the how of creation, but the why and the who of creation. That's kind of like the key phrase of this sermon today. These stories are not attempting to explain the how of creation, but the why and the who. And so when Christians seek to read Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 as science and history, the result is inevitably a false conflict between science and faith. Because astronomers and astrophysicists and evolutionary biologists and chemists and all sorts of other scientists with fancy titles that I really don't know what they mean, they seek to unravel the natural laws of our world, the chemistry, the forces, the matter, and the energy behind all that is. And you don't want your preacher doing that on Sunday mornings, right? The scientific method is what it's called, is focused on helping how things work in our universe. It increases our knowledge. It opens our eyes to the world all around us. That's what scientists help us do. But conversely, theology, or how we think about or talk about God, that's what we do here on Sunday mornings, is intended to help us answer the why question. Why were we created? What is the point of our existence in this life? And I don't want you to think that I'm bashing on science or anything like that, because I'll be the first to admit science has moved humanity forward in incredible ways, life-changing and life-saving ways. It's been able to provide answers for so many different parts of our lives and our world. But science, as good as it may be, doesn't have an answer for everything. But I'll also add, neither does faith. But for so much of human history, people have believed in God simply because they walked outside, they opened their eyes, and they looked around. The natural world is a wonder and a miracle in and of itself. In Psalm 19 in the Old Testament, verses 1 and 2, it says this: "The heavens are telling of the glory of God." The heavens, think about a beautiful sunrise or a sunset. Think about a massive lightning storm or something that just blows your mind that you've seen outside. That is God at work. The second part of that verse says, "And the firmament proclaims his handiwork." That's a word we get in the creation story. The firmament is like the crust of the earth, the dirt, the soil. If you ever want to have your mind blown, learn about the different types of soils and how all that works. It's incredible. Or volunteer in the community garden. There's a thought too. Verse 2 then says, day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. Every day, by going outside, we see God's handiwork at work in the world. And you have to think to yourself, there's a God. There's no way that there's not a God. By simply looking at the complexity of everything around us. Like, again, how does a seed really work and grow? How do animals have instinct? How does the sun really shine and it got just the perfect distance away for the earth to rotate, to have seasons and temperatures where humans can survive? And all the details and intricacies of the sea life and the wildlife and the insects, even as annoying as mosquitoes are, God was involved in it. How are humans born and grow and develop and have a conscience and emotion? God is involved. One thing I love, we have this book in the United Methodist Church called the Book of Discipline. It's our rule book. And as a part of it, we make statements on a lot of the big issues of our society and of our culture. And I wanted to share with you a paragraph that our Book of Discipline says about our relationship between science and faith. It was really helpful. It says this: we recognize science as a legitimate interpretation of God's natural world. We affirm the validity of the claims of science in describing the natural world and determining what is scientific. But we preclude science from making authoritative claims about theological issues, and theology from making authoritative claims about scientific issues. We find that science's description of cosmological, geological, and biological evolution are not in conflict with theology. So that means we're trying to work together to move forward to get answers and to not be two separate camps or try to say two different things. But despite that good effort and people on either side trying to work together, unfortunately, a chasm between science and Christianity has happened along the way. Whether people meant for that to happen or not, it's just a reality. So for our question today, is God real? We ask a more specific question. Can we embrace scientific evidence regarding creation and still be people of faith? I'm asking the question, do I have to pick one or do I have to pick the other? And I would say no. I believe that we can embrace scientific evidence and still be people of faith. I believe that science undergirds the notion that the universe was intentionally created. And that's what the scientists say and believe in well. A vast number of the members of the scientific community have concluded that the universe emerged about 14 billion years ago as a result of what many still call the Big Bang. And I'm not talking about the TV show, The Big Bang Theory, right? This is a scientific event. And it was possibly preceded by a time called cosmic inflation. And this took me back to 9th grade science class, reading all this again. But when the energy would go into the matter and the radiation present today was bound up in space all to itself. It hadn't gone anywhere or done anything yet. But as followers of Christ and people that are trying to be faithful to God and to understand Scripture in context with science, we get to ask the big question: what gave rise or what gave motion to the cosmic inflation and the Big Bang? And scientists don't have an answer for that. We get to ask the question, where then did the energy come from? How could the energy possibly create itself out of nothing? How did all this begin? And the biblical account, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, captures the essence of the Big Bang. And we say that God is the someone behind all of that creative energy in the universe. The Bible tells us that the universe had a beginning point. Remember, it says, first there was nothing and then there was light. And God spoke and the galaxies of the universe were formed. The biblical account tells us that God was the creator, and science helps us understand how, with the Big Bang. But let me say this. I have done my absolute best to sound intelligent and smart this morning with all this science talk. But I'll say it again. I am not a scientist. I would not say this is my theological expertise. I spent a lot of time this week reading chapters from books and articles and begging my friends to send me some of their sermons so I could make sure what I was saying made sense to you. And again, This is not my area of expertise, but the information that I am sharing with you this morning, I want to affirm to you, it's reliable and it's trustworthy. But now that we've kind of made a case for the faith between science and religion and said both can go hand in hand to help us deepen our faith and remove doubt, I want to make it very practical just for you, to ask you some deeper questions that maybe you don't ask yourself on a daily or weekly or even monthly basis. And these are questions that kind of evoke an emotional response to say, well, oh yeah, I guess there really has to be a God. I'll ask it like this. If God isn't real, would you have any real sense of purpose? If God isn't real, who would you be thankful to? Who would forgive you? Would you have any hope if you knew you were actually all alone in this big old universe? Who or what would be your moral compass if God wasn't real? And then here's the looming question that'll fester. Would the world go dark if God wasn't real? I know some of us in the room have witnessed miracles with our own eyes, or we've heard a story from someone we trust and know wouldn't just tell us a story. And we've heard about a miracle that they witnessed. And to me, that's testimony that God is real and God is at work in our lives and the world. And for that we say, thanks be to God. We've sensed God's guidance, or we've been strongly compelled by God, or even heard God's voice in our lives. That proves to me that God is real, and I say, thanks be to God. Perhaps you've experienced what you thought was an amazing coincidence in your life, and actually it was more like a God incident. Prove to you that God was real and at work in your life. For that we say, thanks be to God. Or maybe months or years have gone by and we look in the rearview mirror of our lives and we saw God's leading and provision even when it didn't make sense in the moment, and maybe even when it was really painful. And we say, God was at work. God is real. Thanks be to God. You see, through my faith in Christ, I've come to believe that the painful and the difficult and the challenging times in life do not get the final word on your life. And they don't last forever. I believe that God can redeem them and God could bring something good from them. So as we move into this new year, I hope you'll believe in a God that knows you, and a God that loves you, and a God that cares for you. And a God that loves you and knows you, cares for you so much that he sent his one and only Son, Jesus Christ, to the earth to prove it, to show that he loves you for eternity. And so even if all of your questions can't be answered, and I hope a lot of them will, over the next many weeks, my prayer is that you will know, or at least take the next best step forward for you to believe that God is real and that God is always, always, always at work in your life. God is always doing something good.